Deep in the South Pacific, as the Empire of Japan swept through Asia like a tidal wave, a small island nation stared into the abyss. New Zealand, 14,000 kilometers from the battlefields of Europe, virtually defenseless, and about to build one of the most mocked tanks in military history. But before you laugh, consider this. When Japanese forces captured Singapore in February 1942, they seized enough equipment to arm 10 divisions. Hong Kong had fallen, the Philippines were crumbling, Australia braced for invasion, and New Zealand had exactly 0 tanks. 0 armored vehicles capable of stopping a beach landing. What they did have was a Minister of Public Works with an idea. A desperate, audacious, completely insane idea. His name was Robert Semple, Bob to his friends, a former bartender and union organizer who rose to become one of New Zealand's most colourful politicians. In 1942, with Japanese submarines prowling New Zealand waters and invasion fears reaching fever pitch, Semple looked at his nation's empty arsenal and made a decision. If Britain couldn't send tanks and America wouldn't spare any, then by God, New Zealand would build its own. The result was the Bob Semple tank. 6 machine guns bolted to a farm tractor wrapped in corrugated iron. And yes, it looked exactly as ridiculous as that sounds. But here's what history often forgets. In early 1942, ridiculous was all New Zealand had. The story begins not in a weapons factory, but in the Department of Public Works. Semple's ministry, a government agency responsible for roads and bridges, now tasked with creating an armoured fighting force from absolutely nothing. New Zealand's industrial capacity in 1942 was primitive by military standards. The nation had thrived on agriculture, sheep farming, butter production, not steel foundries, not weapons manufacturing. The country possessed no tank designers, no military engineers experienced in armored warfare, no blueprints to copy. What they did have were tractors, specifically Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, 30 tons of American agricultural machinery designed to clear land and move earth. Slow, reliable, already tracked, and critically, already in New Zealand. Semple's plan was brutally simple. Take the tractor, build an armoured shell around it, mount every machine gun they could find. Create a mobile pillbox that could defend New Zealand's beaches against landing craft and infantry. It would never win a tank battle because New Zealand would never fight one. It just needed to make an invasion costly enough to give the enemy pause. Work began in March 1942 at the railway workshops in Lower Hutt. The designers, if you could call them that, were railway engineers. Men who built locomotives and repaired freight cars. Not weapons. But weapons were what their country needed, so weapons they would build. The hull took shape from corrugated iron and mild steel plating, 12 millimeters thick at most. Tank armor of the era measured in tens of millimeters, sometimes exceeding 100. 12 millimeters would stop rifle bullets. Maybe. It would do absolutely nothing against anti-tank rifles, artillery, or the armor-piercing rounds of actual tanks. But actual tanks weren't the threat New Zealand feared. The threat was infantry pouring off landing barges. And against infantry, corrugated iron was better than nothing. The superstructure rose above the D8's engine in a tall, ungainly box. Multiple flat surfaces. No sloped armor, no curved plates to deflect incoming fire. Every angle a shot trap. The whole thing stood nearly 4 meters tall. For context, a Sherman tank measured less than 3 meters. The Bob Semple was a barn on tracks. visible from kilometers away, a sniper's dream target, but visibility worked both ways. The designers installed 6 Bren light machine guns, 1 in the front, 1 in the rear, 4 on the sides in sponsons that jutted out like the ears of a particularly anxious elephant. Each position had its own gunner, its own firing slit. In theory, the Bob Semple could deliver 360 degrees of suppressive fire. In practice, the crew of 8 men would be crammed inside a metal box that offered minimal protection, no ventilation, and all the comfort of a filing cabinet. The engine was the D8's original diesel motor. 130 horsepower, trying to move what was now a 35-ton behemoth, maximum speed on flat ground, 15 kilometers per hour, a jogging pace. Most tanks of the period could manage 30 to 40. The Bob Semple couldn't run, couldn't chase, could barely lumber. And then there was the ride. The D8's suspension was designed for construction sites, not combat. Every bump transmitted directly into the hull. Every stone in the road rattled the crew like dice in a cup. Aiming the Bren guns while moving would have been nearly impossible. The tank wasn't a fighting platform. It was a moving earthquake that happened to have guns. 3 prototypes were built. Just 3. Production photographs show them lined up at the railway workshops, their crews posing with forced smiles. These men knew. Everyone knew. This wasn't a real tank. This was a scarecrow in armor. A symbol of defiance built from desperation and corrugated roofing material. But symbols matter when you're staring down annihilation. The Bob Semple represented something profound that's easy to miss when you're counting its flaws. It represented a nation that refused to surrender without trying. New Zealand in 1942 had no right to build tanks. No infrastructure, no expertise, no time. They built them anyway. With railway workers and tractors and sheet metal, they built something that could at least pretend to fight back. The military establishment looked at the Bob Semple and saw a joke. And they weren't entirely wrong. By any conventional metric, it was useless. Too slow, too tall, too weak. But conventional metrics assumed conventional warfare. And there was nothing conventional about New Zealand's situation in the dark months of 1942. So the question isn't whether the Bob Semple was a good tank. It wasn't. The question is what New Zealand would have done without it. The Bob Semple tank never fired a shot in anger. Not one. All 3 prototypes remained in New Zealand, scattered to defensive positions around Wellington and Auckland, waiting for an invasion that never came. And that's the strangest twist in this entire story. The tank built from panic and corrugated iron never faced the enemy it was designed to stop. Because by the time the prototypes rolled off the production line in mid-1942, the strategic situation had already shifted. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May, midway in June. The Japanese advance had stalled. The threat to New Zealand, while never completely gone, had diminished from imminent catastrophe to distant possibility. The Bob Semple became a guard dog that never had to bite. It sat at coastal batteries and supply depots, a visible deterrent to an enemy who was now fighting for survival elsewhere. The crews trained, conducted drills, learned to operate the sponson guns in coordination, though the cramped interior made communication nearly impossible without shouting. They practiced maneuvers at the Bob Semple's glacial maximum speed, leaving deep track marks in New Zealand soil that had never known armored warfare. Reports from training exercises were quietly devastating. The tanks overheated in summer. Condensation poured down the inside of the hull in winter, soaking the crew. The Bren guns jammed from vibration. Visibility from the firing slits was so poor that gunners often had no idea what they were shooting at. And the armor, that pitiful 12 millimeters of corrugated hope, proved even less effective than feared. Test firings showed that standard rifle rounds could penetrate at close range. A single anti-tank rifle would have punched through the Bob Semple like it was made of cardboard. Which, spiritually speaking, it was. By late 1942, the strategic absurdity became impossible to ignore. Real tanks were arriving from America. Lend-Lease Shermans and Stuarts, proper armored vehicles with actual armor and actual combat capability. The New Zealand military could finally train on equipment that wouldn't kill its crew through heat exhaustion before the enemy got a chance. The Bob Semple prototypes were quietly withdrawn from active duty. No fanfare, no official decommissioning ceremony. They simply disappeared from the rolls, parked in warehouses and railway yards, forgotten even before the war ended. Now let's talk about what the Bob Semple was actually competing against, because calling it competition is generous. The Japanese Type 95 Heigo light tank, the most common Japanese armor in the Pacific, weighed 7.5 tons. It could reach 45 kilometers per hour. Its 37mm gun could penetrate 30 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. Against a Bob Semple, it wouldn't need the main gun. The Heigo's machine guns alone would have shredded the corrugated iron like tissue paper. The American Stuart light tank, arriving in New Zealand by late 1942, displaced 15 tons. It mounted a 37mm cannon and 3 machine guns in a hull protected by up to 50 millimeters of sloped armor. Maximum speed, 58 kilometers per hour. The Stuart could have circled a Bob Semple 6 times while the New Zealand crew was still trying to rotate their sponsons. Even the British Universal Carrier, essentially an armored tractor itself, outclassed the Bob Semple in every meaningful way. Better armor, better speed, better guns, lower profile. The Carrier wasn't even classified as a tank, and it was still superior. The only comparison where the Bob Semple didn't lose embarrassingly was against absolutely nothing. Against having 0 armored vehicles. In that very specific contest, 6 Bren guns on a tractor beat empty hands. But that's damning with the faintest possible praise. The fate of the 3 prototypes mirrors their combat record. Anticlimactic, mundane, forgotten. One was scrapped for metal during the war, its corrugated iron probably recycled into something more useful. The second disappeared from records entirely, likely cannibalized for parts or abandoned in some railway yard until it rusted into memory. The third survived slightly longer, sitting in storage until the late 1940s before it, too, was cut up and sold as scrap. No Bob Semple tank exists today, not in museums, not in private collections. Not even a single component confirmed to have come from the original prototypes. The most mocked tank in history left no physical trace. Only photographs remain. Grainy black and white images of men standing beside their corrugated hope, faces set in determination that couldn't quite hide the knowledge that they were posing with a punchline. So why was the Bob Semple forgotten? Because militaries don't memorialize their failures. They bury them. The Bob Semple represented everything embarrassing about 1942. The panic, the desperation, the pathetic industrial capacity of a small nation facing annihilation. After the war, when New Zealand's military modernized and integrated into Western defense networks, the Bob Semple became an inconvenient reminder of how close the country had come to total irrelevance. But perhaps that's the wrong lens. Perhaps the Bob Semple shouldn't be remembered as a failure at all. It was never meant to win tank battles. It was meant to say we refuse to die quietly. And in that mission, the Bob Semple succeeded completely. 3 tanks built from tractors and desperation, never fired in combat, scrapped and forgotten. But for a few dark months in 1942, they were all New Zealand had. And sometimes all you have is enough. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe. Because history is full of machines that never should have existed, built by people who refused to accept the impossible.